Hi friends. Well, we made it. We made it to the first part of the Welcome Home quilt. And whether cutting and sewing and prepping day for you is today, tomorrow, or next week, or next month, doesn't matter. I think one of my biggest goals in creating these videos is to just extinguish any fears you have about a certain part of the process, whether it's applique or whether you want some really good pointers about fussy cutting. I like to try and show a couple different methods for doing the same thing. The instruction book, of course, gives you everything that you need, but even within those instructions, sometimes there's some particulars about, a specific fussy cutting positioning that might, the book can't go into like high detail about, that I can give you some extra tips. So that's why we're here. So month one, we are going to mostly be focusing on this center square. So it's kind of like a pineapple, but doesn't go out for lots and lots of corners. You can see that these flowers on the sides are the same as in the center. So that's all cut from the same fabric. And then we have this stripping here. So these are the fabrics that we're using this month. For that center, we're using this colorway of Perth and this colorway of Adelaide, which I absolutely love. It's probably my favorite one. And we're also going to prep the scallops. And I think that that's maybe something that is causing a little trepidation for some of you if you're new to applique or new to like the outer and inner corner of scallops. The instructions go over a couple different methods for doing that, and today we're going to be prepping those. That means just cutting them out. And even in the prepping, you're going to need to kind of go ahead and decide what your method is going to be, whether you needle turn applique it and, in other words, add a seam allowance and turn it back, or you use a raw edge fusible. But we'll just go in order of the booklet. So booklet says month one, let's get started. Here we are getting started. So you can see here, come a little closer. You can see here that you have a big section of a full width of this Perth fabric. Now, some of you might have had the fabric cut here or here. There is plenty of fabric in the kit so that no matter where you're cutting the large square on point, and these are all on point, you can see that tiny little line right there, and then the 4 small squares on point. There's plenty of fabric no matter where your yardage was cut. So let's start with the center square. The center square is this guy right here. You can see it doesn't really stay a square. It basically turns into kind of an odd shaped octagon. When a piece is fussy cut and it's that big and it's bigger than any template that I personally own, I like to make a paper template. Now you can just, draw lines with your grid to get that 18-inch square. And that is an 18-inch cut square, okay? This isn't something that needs to end as 18 inches, so we cut the square at 18.5. This is an 18-inch cut square. So what I decided to do was use my handy Swedish tracing paper and go ahead and make an 18-inch template. I did that because, for one, it's see-through, and it really allows me to center the design of this bouquet in the very center. And one of the ways that I did this was not just by, kind of generally looking at it. I mean, you could draw crosshairs if you wanted to on this piece, but because this isn't like a graphically perfect design, it's a little painterly and irregular, having that little aqua circle right in the center is not hugely important. But what is really cool about this size square on this design of fabric is that if you take the points of the 4 corners here of that square and kind of point them to the outer little flower centers, it gets you really well in center. So that's sort of like a second check, okay? So you have your one in the center and then you have this one, and I just pinned it in place. And I have already got 2 edges cut down here, but I'm gonna use my big grid here to lay on top of that Swedish tracing paper. You could use wax paper, parchment paper, tracing paper, interfacing, anything that you can get smooth and flat and that you can also see through, okay? Now we don't wanna cut way far off because we might be heading into other squares territory, and we don't want to do that. All right, so I think I was off the mat there at the beginning. I do all my worst cutting on camera, just so you know. Okay, so we have that big, beautiful square. All cut now, I think, almost. Never fails. Up, train horn. Okay, so that's that. You can see. So it's cut on point, but it's pieced square. That guy goes right there, okay? I'm gonna set that aside for now. I'm gonna show you the piecing order of that block in just a moment. But before we move on to that, the other pieces that you're supposed to cut from the same fabric, let me get this like all the way out of the way. I'm probably gonna step on a pin. The other pieces that we cut from this fabric are the smaller squares, and those are 8 3/4. Now, I already have mine cut right here, okay? And I wanna talk about these for just a second. So the goal of these is to get that pink flower in the corner, okay? You need to leave yourself enough space around that corner to be able to take a seam allowance and still have the full flower. So what ends up happening with that little pink flower is it gets set into this corner, okay? So you're gonna have enough space now that we've cut it with a space around that flower. And it basically goes like this. We sew it on like this. Clear as mud, right? We sew it on like this basically, and then you have a spare kind of triangle left over. But something that I wanna point out about all these and what they have in common is they all have that pink flower in common, but they also have this blue leaf, okay? So they all look exactly the same. Now the fabric design flips and it flops back and forth on the yardage. I do that so that you can have right facing things and left facing things. So do pay attention to that chart on the page that kind of shows like 2 flowers going this way and then 2 flowers going that way to cut. The most important thing is that you have that blue kind of spotty leaf there and that pink flower in the corner, okay? I'm gonna show you just real quickly how I cut those just using a grid. These are supposed to be 8 3/4. Now, how many of you have an 8 3/4 cutting grid? None of you. And if you don't wanna do a paper template, I'm gonna show you how to do it with a quilt ruler, okay? So again, they're on point. Yep, I think I left, I'm not sure if I have my pink chalk pencil, there it is. I like to use a bright or light colored chalk pencil on this dark fabric. So this is gonna be on point. So that line that's going across the middle of the ruler there, that's kind of like your grain line, your cross grain. And remember, we wanted to get that pink flower in there. And not just that much of it, but we wanna leave a little bit of room, okay? And I'm kind of putting that grain line, that center line, in between the center of the flower there, and that looks like a nice border around it. So what I'm gonna do, I'm starting at the 1 here, and these need to be 8 3/4. I'm gonna draw a chalk line and stop at the 8 3/4 mark on this corner, and then I'm gonna do it again on this corner, okay? And then pick up my ruler and turn it around. We're gonna build a square out of those other 2 points. So see my chalk line here and down there, and this little is the 8 3/4. And I go all the way up to where I stopped, and same over here, all the way up to where I stopped. And then we draw our other 2 edges. Now, you could also, I'm just drawing to show you where that square is sitting. If you're bold, you could go ahead and make cuts instead of drawing. But I like to draw and have a look at it first and then go back and use my rotary and the grid to cut, okay? But that's how you do that. I'm gonna get this out of the way, push. All right, so the next thing that we cut, I'm gonna go ahead and lay this down in the center here. The next thing that we cut is the Adelaide fabric. We cut 4 squares, okay? And those guys, you can read it in your book, but I'll go ahead and tell you. Those guys are 4 7.5-inch squares, okay? Those are these guys. Those of you that may have made pineapple blocks before know that you just take this whole square and sew on a line that I've already drawn there, corner to corner, trim off, all that excess goes away, and then it turns back like that, okay? So we'll just go ahead and fake these guys in place so you can kind of see how this is gonna work, just in case you haven't made a pineapple square before. Some of them are really, really pretty. They start really tiny and they keep getting all these strips all the way out. I, of course, made my center nice and big because I wanted to show off that print. Okay, so the next pieces of the Adelaide fabric are strips, and these guys are cut at 2 3/4 thick and then 2 different lengths long. So the shorter ones are 18 inches. And what does that match? That matches this guy. Because once you start with this 18-inch block and then you sew on all corners and turn back, you end with an 18-inch block, okay? So then we're gonna put these strips on here, and then the longer ones go at the top. Now, there is a little call out that I wanna make about the cutting instructions for this fabric. So, you know, when those of you that are familiar with sub-cutting, you know that you can say things like cut 2 long 3 1/4 inch strips by width of fabric. So in other words, just cut 2 3/4 inch all the way across the fabric, right? And then sub-cut, in other words, take that strip and cut it into something smaller. The instructions tell you to cut 2 long width of fabric strips, sub-cut 2 into the 18 inches, and sub-cut the other 2 into 22.5. Well, 2 times 22.5 is 45, which is just a bit longer than the width of the fabric. So I'm here to give you the little tip that even if you just cut on that center fold, so you just do 1 width, even though these aren't gonna be exactly 22.5 inches wide, what ends up happening, you can see there, they're shorter. You can still center and sew them on there because all this is gonna get cut off anyway, isn't it? Yes, it is, because this is gonna get sewn here, and then it's gonna get sewn like that. So basically everything that's on the other side of this point, all that's gonna get trimmed off anyway, so it won't matter that that's too short, okay? And then that gets done like that. Hope that makes sense. Now, the other thing that you could do, you have enough fabric in your kit to just go ahead and cut 3 widths of the Adelaide print at 2 3/4 inch wide, and so that you can get the full 22.5 inches. But I just wanted to call that out so no one gets confused. But this is what this looks like when it's all pieced together. Yay, we have a center pineapple block. Okay, cool. The next part of month 1 or part 1 or whatever you want to call it is prepping your scallops. Now remember, I mentioned that you do need to go ahead and decide whether you're going to turn the edges or whether you're going to use like a fusible fabric on the back of it. The great thing about this pattern is it goes through, the pattern booklet, excuse me, does go through various methods. It goes through a couple different methods of how you might want to do that and what the differences are. It goes through all of it right there, like the applique. Okay, so, and how to prep it and how it's different. All right, so today what I did, and when we get back into the applique, I'll kind of show you some other methods. Today what I did was I prepped the scallop pieces as though I'm going to be making, or I started to prep them, as though I'm going to be making needle turn applique, which is my favorite. So the first instruction for these is to cut the widths of the scallop strips. And I'm gonna start by showing you this whole yardage right here. Now, one thing in particular, whether you're using raw edge and cutting right on the line or whether you're adding a seam allowance, it's this blue motif here that's right at the very top. It's not perfect. It's not set perfect or the same on every single one because we are humans, we're not machines. And same goes for this one here. So that's the fabric I have out right now, and I want to show you the spacing that you need to allow to cut these guys. So it asks you to put 1/4 of an inch of space above this blue kind of archway here. Now, again, this is sort of hand-drawn. These are sort of hand-drawn designs. They're not gonna be like mechanically perfect, both because of the design and the way fabric is printed and the way it gets stretched. So I'm gonna just get a little pointer here. So that line of being right at the top is here. We want to cut our strips, our beginning strips, about 1/4 inch above, roughly. And so what I do is I just lay this grid down and leave that 1/4 inch of space and kind of keep checking all the way across. And so when I come all the way down here and I have 1/4 inch above that arch, when I go back across, some of them look a little lower, some will look a little higher. It doesn't matter. And one thing that is probably gonna happen too is that grid is no longer gonna be sitting perfectly square on your fabric. It might be a little tilted. It does not matter. This is not something to get stressed out about because what's most important is that it's sitting on the design, and fabric is rarely printed perfectly on grain. It is not gonna mess anything up because you're cutting curves here anyway, okay? And you're appliquing. It's not like you're sewing 2 straight pieces of fabric together. So once you've lined up that first run, you can take your rotary and cut, and then just pull your fabric down and slide down again and continue. And once you have that top edge cut, what you want to do is, let's just pretend this is our clean edge. It's not, but let's pretend. Put the 4.5 line at that new cut line and cut a 4.5 inch strip. So what we're wanting to finish with is a 4.5 inch wide strip, but the top of it to be very specific. And I'll show you what that looks like from the white fabric. Now the blue one, it doesn't matter which one of these rows you start on, whether you start, I just start on the one that is like a full scallop at the edge instead of the half. You're gonna need 10 of these, okay, all the way across. And I'll show you more specifically how the scallops work. So when you cut your strips, they look like this, right? They look like this, and they have a little space there. And then when you use your scallop template, you can see that that template's gonna encompass that blue edge. Now then, if you are doing raw edge applique and you want to have some fusible behind there, you need to go ahead and put your fusible on the back of the fabric, either after these strips are cut or even before the strips are cut, so that when you go trace your scallops in place, then all your fabric and fusible is already fused and put together, okay? Because you don't want to cut like a scallop shape of fusible and a scallop shape of fabric and try to get them to match and iron and press and fuse together. That's too difficult. So definitely, at least when you start at this stage, you want to go ahead and have fusible on the back of this whole thing. As I mentioned, I'm doing needle turn applique. Before, I just assumed that everybody has that template. This is the same shape here in your book, okay? We just made a template that has like 3 in a row to save you from continuing to move. Now you can use this shape right here and make your own template out of freezer paper or template plastic on your own and cut it out. Some shops did bring these in, so check with your shop in case they have this template. I do still have this template available on my website, so if you want to give yourself time to get that in, we will ship one to you. And maybe just save this part for a little bit later until you get the template. So what I did here was I used that template. Out of the white fabric, we need 7. So I used the template to draw right above that blue line. And that should come really close to matching the bottom here, okay? So I'm drawing, this is just, I don't know, I don't think it's just a regular kind of fine Sharpie. Now, this line that I'm drawing right now is one that I am going to turn under. So when I turn, I'm not going to draw all the way down here. I'm going to stop and slide it down. I kind of like, instead of going here to make sure I'm straight, I just go ahead and keep that one in my last drawn line when I do multiple and continuous scallops. The only time you want to draw all the way down towards the end is when you come to the very end of your row, and I need to do 7. So I only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so I'm going to do another 2. So again, I'm slipping the first part of the template into the last drawn scallop. And we want to encompass that blue a little bit. You can see I start getting a little lower. That's okay. That line, I'm really good at interrupting myself. That drawn line that I have here, when I go to needle turn applique this, and I can go all the way down now, I'm gonna turn and turn. See, I've already trimmed this out, but I gave myself a seam allowance. I didn't cut right on the line. When I do my needle turn applique and I sew, I'm gonna keep turning that line until I don't see the line anymore, okay? So that's sort of like my, if I can see the line, that means I need to tuck just a little bit more, all right? So I did just go in with scissors and cut to give myself a seam allowance. It is not a perfect seam allowance, and it doesn't matter because you're gonna be turning that down by hand. You could also use this form if you want to wrap and press around. In this instance, because we want to draw all the scallops, I find that a little fussy, because if you're to wrap and press this around like I've done before with foil, you may or may not be perfectly hiding your line. So I've just sort of made a commitment to go ahead and draw the line and use that as my guide to turn the fabric back as I sew. But we'll go over more applique tips in later months when we're actually sewing it on to the backgrounds. But that, I think, wraps up everything for this first part of the Welcome Home Quilt. If you are viewing this video on Facebook, feel free to leave your own tips, maybe that are same or different. And also any comments or questions you might have, we'll try to get to them. Or either me or someone on the Free Spirit team hopefully will get to your questions. And good luck and happy sewing.